on YouTube and linked on our website for those who missed the session, or if you want to watch it again, it will be there.
Si necesita ayuda en español, por favor envíe un correo electrónico a studentassignment@wcpss.net y alguien se comunicará con usted mañana.
Thank you, Susan. This evening's session will focus on a possible school calendar change from multi-track year-round to single-track or traditional starting in 2028-2029 for Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle. As a reminder, today's session was prepared by the Long Range Planning Department and the Office of Student Assignment. And the information we will review with you this evening is a subset of the full presentation that was shared with the board during their Facilities Committee meeting on March 10th. Again, this evening's session will focus on Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle. Before we begin, let me go over some logistics. Our session will last for no more than an hour and a half. We will begin with a presentation and conclude by responding to questions from today's session. We recognize that now and throughout the session, you may have questions about the process or the possibility of a calendar change for your school. To capture your questions, we will be using the Q&A feature within Google Meet. To access this feature from a computer, please click the grid shape in the toolbar on your screen. If you are using a mobile device, select the three dots first, then select the icon with the three shapes. You should then see a Q&A feature identified by a question mark icon. To ensure your questions are anonymous, moderators will be monitoring the Q&A for questions and capturing them throughout this evening's session. Once you see that your question has been removed from the Q&A, that means that your question has been successfully captured by our moderators, and you do not need to resubmit your question. We will make every effort to respond to your questions toward the end of our session. In addition, we will use your questions to update the FAQ portion of our website.
Y si necesita ayuda en español, por favor envíe un correo electrónico a studentassignment@wcpss.net y alguien se comunicará con usted mañana.
Additionally, we are asking that you contribute to the larger community discussion related to this initial discussion on calendar changes via Thought Exchange. The Thought Exchange will remain open through April 5th. After it has closed, we will summarize the feedback received and will share this summary with the board during their Facilities Committee meeting on April 14th. No one will be personally identified in the summary. Before I turn things over to Susan, we would like to remind you that today's session will focus on Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle. By the end of this evening's session, you will have had an opportunity to briefly review the process for recommending calendar changes, extensively review the schools in your area that may benefit from a change in calendar, quickly review the timeline for the planning process, and perhaps most importantly, submit questions you have that will help you gain a better understanding of the potential impacts of a school calendar change for your family. And now I will turn things over to Susan Pulliam.
Thank you, Melissa, for welcoming all of us this evening, and thank you to everyone for joining us. As Melissa mentioned in the opening, we know how beautiful it is outside, and we're sorry to keep you indoors. Hopefully, maybe some of you are sitting on a porch or an outside area while you're listening in. We also want to just take a moment and remind you that all the information we're going to share tonight is available on our website, particularly on step 6 of the assignment planning page. To provide a little bit of context, on March 10th, staff members shared an initial discussion on the topic of school calendar change with the Facilities Committee of the Board of Education. This discussion centered on possible recommendations for the 2028-29 school year. To clarify, no specific recommendations have been made at this time. We are in the gathering input stage and we're collecting feedback through our thought exchange and, of course, tonight's session to help the planning team make final recommendations. We recognize that some of you may just now be joining us and want to remind everyone that we will be using the Q&A feature in the Google Meet to capture your questions today. To access this feature from a computer, look for the grid shape on your toolbar. If you're using a mobile device, look for and you'll see three shapes. I think it's a triangle, a square, and a circle. Ultimately, you're looking for this Q&A question mark. You'll be able to submit your questions there. To make sure that your questions are anonymous, we will be capturing them anonymously. When you see that your question has been removed from the Q&A tool, that's your indication that our moderators have successfully captured your question and will address it later in tonight's session. We will make every effort to respond to all of the questions that we received tonight. And of course, we'll be using this same information to update the FAQ portion of our website for those that maybe weren't able to join us this evening. We also want to continue to encourage you to participate in the thought exchange. It will remain open through April 5th. And we will then, once it's closed, summarize all of the feedback that has been received and share that with the board during a facilities committee on April 14th. To ensure that you have a better understanding of how the school area were identified for potential calendar conversion, we want to take a few minutes to briefly review the planning process. We follow an annual planning cycle that has as the first step in the planning process the annual enrollment forecast or membership forecast. For the 26-27 planning cycle, we are in actually the final step of the process, which is here. So, what you may not realize is that the annual enrollment plan happens in November, that's step 4. Then we continue on to try to identify which schools maybe weren't able to successfully be addressed in the enrollment plan, but potentially could benefit from some changes. So, what we're discussing today is that last step in the 26-27 cycle and is going to be for the 28-29 school year. And I know that feels a little bit off, but that's because the board has asked us to give families and schools as much time as possible to know what those decisions might be, particular to calendar change. So they have as much time as possible to prepare for how those changes might impact them, their families, or even the school staff itself. So as we're in this step, make sure I've got my notes all caught up. We're looking at which schools could benefit potentially from a calendar change. Um, First, we're going to look at the first 5 steps. You can see how we got here, and then we'll talk more in detail about not the recommendations, but this area and why we're thinking recommendations might be beneficial. That enrollment forecast process has actually already occurred for the next planning cycle. So we thought we would share with you that most current information. And what you can see is that the rate of growth in the district is starting to slow. We're still growing as a district. We're still an economic, center for the region, but student enrollment is no longer projected to continue to expand, sort of almost exponentially. It's starting to look like we're going to grow by, 0.5%, 1% instead of those 7 or 8% gains that we used to get in our highest periods of growth. This gives you a distribution of how that growth is projected across the county. So knowing how many students the district is going to need to serve over the next several years is important, but knowing where those students are most likely going to be located as that growth occurs is really helpful for our planning team. And what you'll see here, hopefully, is that this growth is not evenly distributed throughout the district. And there are some areas of the district that are projected to grow while others are projected to stabilize. What the blue arrows mean for you is that those are considered high rates of growth. And you'll see they're kind of on the fringes, sort of outside of 540, if you will. And then in the more central parts of the county that have kind of built out, you're starting to see some stabilization. Here you can see a comparison of that distribution based on last year's forecast and this year's forecast. So again, these are looking at a 10-year forecast. So 10 years down the road, this is what we're predicting would be where the sort of growth areas would be located and where the stable areas are located. And you can see there's a slight difference. The general location of the growth is about the same, but maybe the degree or extent of the growth is slowing down a little bit. The next step in our process is then to look at how that projected crowding is going to, or what that projected growth is going to look like for the very next school year. So going into the 26-27 school year, we're projecting that schools will have a certain level of crowding. Here you see a quick image of all three levels: elementary, middle, and high school. Let's take a little bit deeper. Well, and we'll kind of through those in your area a little bit sooner, but this is the elementary projected crowding map, the middle school, and the high school projected crowding map. The darker the red, the more crowded that particular school site is projected to be. The lighter sort of gray color, the less crowded. The next thing that we look at, or the third step in our annual cycle, is to look at the capital improvement plan updates to determine where new schools might be coming online or where renovations might be occurring throughout the district that could potentially add capacity to individual school. The map on the top shows you where the new school construction locations are. You can see in green those that opened this school year, in orange the one that's projected to open for 26-27, and those in the sort of dark gray or black circles are those in future years. Similarly, on the lower map, you'll see the location of schools that are projected to have major renovations, and several of these could potentially have additional capacity. And so we're keeping an eye on how those might impact student enrollments in those regions. The board is currently considering an update to the capital improvement plan to determine which schools will be named for the seventh year of the plan. And they're looking to get those decisions made in the next month or so. The fourth step in the process then is to look at our annual enrollment plan. So we haven't started that process we've barely started that process for the 27-28 cycle, but we have completed it for 26-27. So all recommended changes for the upcoming school year were approved by the board back in November. The next step in our process, once we get a plan approved, is to look at which schools are so severely overcrowded that they perhaps need to have a cap placed on them which for those of you who are familiar with caps, that means that students who move into the base attendance area for the school may not be able to fit in their actual assigned school, and they would be sent to what is called an overflow school. They'd be given transportation and essentially treated like a base student at that school, but it is an alternative school for those families moving in new to an area where there's already such severe crowding. In addition, at the same time, we might be looking at schools that could have a cap removed. For this particular cycle, the board was able to remove caps from a few schools, one in your area, Heritage High School, and then had to add a cap at Zebulon Magnet Elementary. You'll see here highlighted in green the school in your region that has a cap remaining, and that's Abbott's Creek. It's a little distant from you, but it's the closest one to your area that still has a cap in place. While I have this group together, a reminder that when the board does take a cap off of a school like Heritage High School, it doesn't necessarily mean that the school is under enrolled or ready for transfers. It simply means that we can now serve any student who moves into the base attendance area for the school. So if families are moving into the attendance area for Heritage High School, they can be served and not worry about being sent to an overflow school. But we still have to monitor their enrollment very closely, and the school won't be open for transfers for a couple of years at least. Now we enter into where we are today, and that is step 6 in our overall planning cycle. And here you'll see that we've already completed a few steps. We reviewed our CAP schools. We looked at schools that were not operating on multi-track that could benefit from having the extra seats and capacity that multi-track provides. And we also started looking at schools that perhaps no longer need to have a multi-track year-round calendar because they would be able to sufficiently serve their students on a single track or traditional calendar. So we're at the next step here that you see, step 4 highlighted. That's where we are today actively, is hosting our engagement sessions for our families and school staff to gain better insights and additional feedback before we make any specific recommendations to the board. I know some of you joined us a little bit late in the process, so you might not have seen this notice. If you do have questions for us today, please use the Q&A feature. Once you see that your question has been removed, that lets you know that our moderators have successfully captured your question, and we'll get to it hopefully in just a few minutes. Before we jump into your specific area, let's just make sure we have some common definitions for terms. So in our district, the term capped school very specifically means that the enrollment is restricted because student numbers or membership have exceeded the classroom capacity, and no new students are generally enrolled in the school, meaning they're sent to a different alternative or overflow school. If it's a crowded school, it's not quite at the point where we're sending new families to a different school, but we will most likely have to close it to transfers and monitor the crowding at the school to determine what else might need to be done to make sure that the common areas and the programs in the school can be delivered effectively despite the crowding. An underutilized school, on the other side, has room to grow. So, this is a school that has enrollment that is below usually around 85% capacity. And that means that could negatively impact programming, particularly at a multi track year round school where it's hard to stretch those resources across 4 tracks when they're not fully enrolled. Um, so, we just want to make sure we're monitoring those to determine whether or not they need to remain on the multi track schedule or calendar. The other thing we need to think about, particularly at the elementary, are things like class size legislation. Do have restrictions on how many students can be served in kindergarten, first, second, and third grade based on state legislation. You can see those numbers here. We need to be looking at projected enrollment growth. In some areas of our district, we have recently opened schools, particularly at the elementary level and one high school. So it could be that they're there ahead of the growth, and we just need to be patient and let that enrollment growth fill the school. Other things we have to think about are first floor egress options for our kindergarten and first grade students, things like program space needs. Uh, do we have the right spaces available for the programs that need to serve the students at the school? Are schools already doubling up in co-teaching in our overcrowded schools? Do we have core facilities that are being overburdened by overcrowding or maybe not well used because the school is so underutilized? When we're looking specifically at our schools that are underutilized, and again, we're sort of looking at that 85% or under capacity, percent use. There's a couple of options that are really quickly available to us, things like adjusting the boundary of the school if we could identify a nearby crowded school and perhaps reassign some students into that open space. We could encourage choice into the school if that's appropriate for the area, particularly for our magnet schools. And we could also look at reducing the capacity. And there's two ways that we can do that. One would be looking at whether or not there are trailers or mobile classrooms on the campus and if those could be removed. And of course, the conversation that brings us all together today is whether or not the school needs to continue to operate on a multi track year round calendar. Here we can talk you through a little bit more of the nuance to it. So as we look at schools across the district that are meeting that threshold of operating below 85%, a couple of planning questions we can ask ourselves. Is there projected growth in the region sufficient to fill all of the seats in all the schools in the area? And if so, we might just say, let's let it sit for a minute and let's come back and look at it in a year or two. Let's see how that residential development impacts the growth of the student body at the school. Are there schools nearby that are overcrowded? Could the school potentially serve as an opportunity to relieve those overcrowded schools through some sort of reassignment? Are there, I mentioned earlier, excess numbers of mobile units on the campus that are just not needing to be used? Or are there, units that we could easily remove from the campus and that would sort of increase our utilization and decrease our maintenance costs at the campus? So that's something that we look at. And then again, what brings us together today is looking at that calendar optimization. The last one you see on this particular graphic about program adjustment, that's sort of an extreme measure. We don't use it very often. We're still a growing district. So, the idea of maybe closing a school or reimagining the purpose of a school isn't something we really use a lot as a district, but just thinking about long range planning, obviously, if we have an underutilized school years and years from now, it could be that we would look at whether or not it still needs to serve the purpose that it's serving today. One thing that we did share with our board members during the presentation, and we'll be honest with you about, is we recognize that that sort of step 4, looking at the calendar optimization, is perhaps one of the most disruptive for families, for staff, for school community, for the culture that you've developed at your school. Taking a school from traditional to multi track, taking a school from multi track for traditional or single track for, all of those have repercussions that we do understand are very impactful for families. So we don't enter into it lightly. And as a staff and as a long range planning team, we really only seek to make recommendations to the board about reducing or changing the calendar of a school if we feel like it's the most feasible financially beneficial option for the district long term. And so before we make those recommendations, we really take very seriously the importance of receiving your feedback and looking at the community as a whole. The other thing we have to think about is, let's say it's time. Let's say it really is time for a school to reduce its total number of tracks. If you have a school that's not operating a track two, immediately it makes it less efficient. And it means that the principal is having to stretch their resources to try to make them work across just those three tracks because they don't have enough students to fully staff all of their programs. It could mean that there are substitutes for a period of time because they don't have enough specialists to cover all of the months of the school year. It could mean that some students don't have access to the same level of math curriculum on a particular track if there aren't enough students. So there's different types of things that can impact the operations of your school and also could put the district in a bit of a pinch having to find extra resources to add to the school when their student enrollment numbers don't justify sort of staying on multi-track. So those are just some reasons why it comes up. And a couple of things to think about is that if a school were to go multi-track to traditional, as a historical perspective as a district, it then makes it very difficult for that school to go back to multi-track at some later point in time if growth is coming in the region. So you have seen in a couple of places where the district has said, let's not go from multi-track to traditional. Let's go from multi-track to track four. That gives us the flexibility that if the growth is still several years out and it just doesn't make sense for the school to be operating on a multi-track calendar today and for the next couple of years, that perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, when that residential development picks back up, we're already operating on a track four. So we just sort of grow into having all four tracks. If you're familiar with Lake Myra Elementary in Wendell, it's experiencing that now. It's been operating on track four for a little while. It opened as multi track. It's been operating on track four for several years. The growth has finally picked up in Wendell Falls to a point where the school is ready, and it's now going to go multi track next year. So that would be a consideration is if there's growth projected, it's just not here now, would we want to think about that? Another option would be we really just don't need the capacity, or maybe there's some access issues. I know particularly at the middle school level, having students tracked out when maybe their club or their sport or one of those after school activities is still going on makes it real hard for them to get to school during those track out periods. Is that a concern? Should we be thinking about middle schools being traditional so students can get to and from school, when all of their activities are happening? So just lots of things to weigh and consider. So if you've got questions about those, please, add those to the Q&A tool. So let's jump in, right? In this area, the two schools that have kind of popped up as potentially not needing the multi-track year-round anymore, specifically for capacity purposes, are Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle School. What you see here is that the percent crowding with their trailers for Heritage Elementary is for the current school year, based on the head count, at 20th day at the beginning of the school year, was around 74%. And at the middle school level, it was around 77%. Neither school operates track two currently. And so that is a sign for us that the school isn't sufficiently full enough to warrant needing the multi track year round calendar. In addition, the middle school doesn't have any mobile units. So there's no capacity adjustment in that space. At the elementary school, there are several units, and if we were to remove all of them, they would still be at 93% crowded. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Additionally, for these two schools in particular, the 5-year enrollment change. So over the last 5 years, they've both lost around 10% of their enrollment. So they're in an area that's showing continued reduction in student membership. Again, this was the chart that I showed you for those of you just joining us that shows how the growth has projected across the county. And so let's look a little bit closer at this region. So where the schools are located is at the tip of this orange arrow, kind of roughly in this area. And yes, north of the school and east of the school, or the two schools, you can see that there's a lot of stabilization kind of right around in the attendance area. So at this point, the question is, do they need to continue to operate multi-track year round? If we look at the projected crowding just for next year in this area, again, zooming in, you can see that many schools in the area, particularly at the elementary level, are showing sufficient space to absorb the growth. We have a couple of schools that are showing some growth and that are showing that they might. So it's something to keep in mind in this particular region. And so just looking at Heritage Elementary, I told you there was roughly a 10% decrease over the last 5 years. So for the last 4 years, you can see how that enrollment has changed over just these last 4 years. At the elementary school, again, looking at those schools that have available capacity, this is just seen differently, that crowding number that I showed you. If we look at the projected crowding in the region, several schools have sufficient capacity to absorb the growth that's coming in the next couple of years. I mentioned this a couple of slides ago, but currently other considerations at the elementary level is that the school is not operating a track two. It does have 8 mobile classrooms on its site. There isn't significant enrollment growth projected in the base attendance area for the school. We do know that north and east of the school, there is some growth that's projected, and that these students feed into Heritage Middle School. And of course, they're both located on the same campus. So if any changes were made at the elementary level, we have to determine how that would impact the middle school. Looking now at the middle schools, same conversation. Let's zoom in. There is sufficient capacity in the region at the middle school level. I think some of you may know Roseville Middle recently went from being a multi track year round middle school to being a traditional middle school. And so, with all of the available capacity, Wake Forest is at 82%, Wakefield Middle is at 68%. They're already operating on a traditional calendar, so we can't, reduce tracks for those schools. So there is sufficient capacity in the region to absorb the growth at the middle school level. Looking at the Heritage Middle, you can see a very similar pattern, continued reduction in total enrollment over the last several years. And again, just seen slightly differently, looking at the total available capacity in the region. Even if we were to remove trailers, with the exception of Wake Forest Middle, there's still sufficient capacity in the region to absorb the growth without needing the use of trailers. So Heritage Middle, again, same as Heritage Elementary, is not operating on a track two. I mentioned earlier, it does not have any mobile units on its campus. And again, there's not a significant amount of enrollment growth projected in its base attendance area. And we do need to think about the fact that it's not just Heritage Elementary students that feed into Heritage Middle. Jones Dairy also feeds into Heritage Middle. And so we have to think about what that multi-track year-round elementary school feeding into Heritage Middle would look like if changes were made to Heritage Middle's calendar. Some have asked, particularly in the thought exchange, are our students performing better and doing better because they're on multi-track year round? And there's been a lot of research in recent years. And so these are more recent research studies that have been presented that say essentially, when you look across students across all subgroups, that there is not a statistically significant difference in student outcomes if they're on traditional or multi-track. I know that for individual families, for individual students, there is potentially a difference because of how that student is wired and how that student maybe needs breaks or doesn't need breaks. We hear kind of different things on scheduling for some students. They really need a consistent schedule day after day, and traditional works better for them. Others need that little bit of a break, and that 1 or 2 or 3 week break that you can get in a year-round type school can help them to reset and gather themselves and then kind of restart for that next quarter. So we know that individually there are individual student differences, but as a whole, the research shows that the calendar in and of itself isn't the driving factor for student performance. It's usually other factors like teacher quality, student readiness, those sorts of things. But these articles are available on our website if you're interested in reading through them and learning more about that research. Again, everything we've shared tonight is available on our district website, particularly our assignment planning section. If you received one of our emails, you might have been directed to the calendar conversion spot, and that's essentially step six. Step six links to that page. So whichever way you're going, you're getting to that same set of information. I know given a lot of information. We've got a little bit more to go. So before we jump into our questions, just to remind you, if you're joining us late, please use the Q&A feature. If you see that your question has been removed, that lets you know that our moderators has successfully captured your question. So let's quickly give you the next steps and then let's jump into your questions. So right now we have our website open. Our thought exchanges are opening and collecting feedback. You're not the only area impacted. There are 2 other areas of the county that are being considered for potential calendar changes. The March 16th session that you see there actually got moved because of the inclement weather. It's going to be scheduled for March 24th. So if you know anyone in the Holly Springs area, they should have received that notice. And then we have our final session for the Northwest region on the 26th. So we're hosting our community engagement sessions, we're collecting the feedback, we're identifying potential recommendations, and we will bring specific recommendations to the board through their facility committee on April 14th. And here you see that more official timeline of the board. We do think that the board will want to hear a final set of recommendations at a May 5th work session so the full board can hear those recommendations. And it's our understanding that they'll most likely be May 19th before they take it up as an action item at a board meeting. Melissa, am I turning things back over to you now?
Yes, thank you,
Okay, I'm going to get
Susan.
some water.
That was a lot of information. Thank you. And now we'd like to start addressing as many of your questions as possible. Please take a few minutes and post any questions or comments in the Q&A feature. Again, as a reminder, to submit your questions using this feature on your computer or mobile device. As you continue to post the questions, we will start addressing ones that are already in the queue. Also, please remember to contribute to the thought exchange. Um, that's a really meaningful and important way for us to gather additional information. So, looking at questions, Susan, are you ready to get started?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So let's start with some questions related to why are we considering these changes? The first one, aside from enrollment numbers, what other factors are driving the proposed calendar change for heritage schools?
It is simply the enrollment numbers because as in our role as long range planners, we're thinking about fiscal responsibility and good use of taxpayer resources. And right now, multi track year round schools that are under enrolled simply cost more to operate than they sort of generate through their student membership. So it really is an operational efficiency approach.
Okay, next one. What was the data considered before proposing a calendar change due to under enrollment?
So the data that we look at as we sort of talk through in our steps, so this question may have come early on, we look at the projected enrollment for the area based on an annual membership forecast. We do them every single year. We work with our municipal partners to get their most up-to-date residential information to help us determine what type of growth is coming. One thing we're starting to see in some of our communities is that while population will continue to grow, more and more senior living residential developments are being approved, which don't generate students or very few students, if many. So, for some municipal areas, and I think Roseville and Wake Forest in particular, total population growth for the region may look a little bit different than student enrollment growth as they try to diversify their residential housing. But we do work with our county partners to get that information, and then we use a demographer to help us take some economic factors into consideration. We look at birth rates across the district and various trends. If you're interested in knowing more about that, our complete forecast document and report is available on the website. You can find it on that same website that we've been sharing if you'd like to know more about all those data factors that are considered as we develop the forecast, because that's really what's driving not just tomorrow, but 5 or 10 years from now, what type of capacity we think we're going to need in the region.
All right, next one. Do you reach out to the towns to get their growth numbers? And is your information the same as information provided by Wake Forest commissioners?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. But again, I mentioned what may be a little bit different is total population growth versus student population growth. Those can be slightly different numbers based on the types of housing that's coming into a region.
Okay, the next questions are related, kind of two sides of the same question. Why are Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle being considered for potential calendar change when there are already traditional calendars, elementary and middle schools nearby within a mile? And then why would you eliminate the only multi-track year-round middle school in the area?
Thank you for that. And as a district, we've had this history of using multi-track, and it's really a recent history. It's been about the last 20 years, which I know doesn't sound like recent history, but as a district that's close to 50 years, actually is 50 years old now, multi-track really only started being used in our district when we were experiencing high rates of population growth in certain areas. And then secondarily, when the legislature approved a class size change for kindergarten through third grade, which restricted how many students could be served in each of those classes, which generated a need for immediate need for new seats, new elementary seats in the district, and we were, restricted with our construction dollars. As a district, you may not be aware, we currently have 203 schools, soon to have 204 in operation. And so when we're looking at enrollment growth, student membership, and capacity availability throughout the district and by region, those are really what drive these discussions. So, multi-track year-round has become somewhat commonplace in our district, but it was not necessarily ever intended to be always available. Multi-track was really leveraged to help us deal with rapid growth in areas where we couldn't keep up with school construction and or with trailer movement. So as this, district starts to stabilize in certain regions where we had to rely so heavily on multi-track, we don't need to anymore. And again, it costs us more to operate an under enrolled multi track school than it would if that same school was operating on track four or traditional. Some of it is, overhead, but a lot of it is staffing because of the way you have to uniquely staff a multi track school to ensure that things like specials and electives are available across all four tracks, or special education services or counseling services, all those types of services that students might need throughout the day in addition to their classroom teacher. Those are very difficult to sort of fund when the school is not fully enrolled. And so we see and understand and hear very clearly the perspective of, but we like multi track and we really want to keep year round. And if these two schools, let's say, go traditional, our closest year round options are, maybe two towns away. We hear that, and that's going to be something the planning team has to take into consideration before final recommendations are made.
All right, let's move on to enrollment and growth related questions.
Sure.
First one, what happens if enrollment numbers go up significantly despite your current forecast in the next 2 years?
That's an excellent question, and the planning team is going to continue to review information that helps us look through that. Right now, the trends in this area, as you've seen, have been decreases in enrollments by as much as 10% over the last several years. So even if there is some rapid growth, the schools could absorb that growth. But you're not wrong. We have to constantly pay attention to those trends and those changes. But again, we get a very good information from our municipal partners. They're great in sharing all of their planning updates. We have lists and lists and lists of subdivisions, start dates, end dates, total number of units, types of housing. So we do have a solid grasp on the total number of students that should be coming to an area over time.
How has Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle base school zoning adapted to the roughly 40% population growth from the last decade in Wake Forest? And where did those families get assigned?
Yeah. So if you'll look at the area, I'm going to pull up one of the graphics because I think it'll help. We have quite a few schools in the region. We caught up. So at the elementary level, let me see if I can pull this one up. You can see that there are quite a few elementary schools serving this sort of corner of the county. And we've got sufficient space in several schools in this area, as you can see, that are in that light gray color. The schools here closer to the county line are getting a little bit more full, but we've just added more and more elementary schools. Richland Creek was added at one point. Um, Believe it or not, Jones Dairy and Sanford Creek are relatively new in the region over the last several years. So the district has just been able to catch up with those new schools. And again, at the middle school level, even with Roseville Middle, going from multi-track to traditional, the middle school, we have sufficient capacity. We've been building slightly bigger middle schools over the last several years, and so you're seeing that the capacity is there, and it's maintaining the student membership.
Okay, next question. Just east of Heritage appears to be in the future projected growth areas based on the map shared.
Mhm.
Has a plan to expand the base school zone for Heritage Elementary and Middle School, um, with others shifting east and southeast considered?
That is definitely under consideration because, as you can see at the elementary level, there are schools that are starting to top out with their capacity. So the question becomes, is it better to reassign students into Heritage Elementary from these areas that are maybe a little bit more crowded? Or is it better to let those areas serve their students and for Heritage to perhaps, operate on a single track or a traditional calendar? So, yes, that is a question that's continuing to be evaluated even into today. At the middle school level, it's a little bit different because there's no need to relieve any schools in the area. So there's no like overcrowded schools or even potentially getting close to crowded schools. So it's a different conversation at the middle school level. At the middle school level, it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of need for shifting of students. Um, the schools in the area are currently serving their populations fine.
Okay. The projected elementary school crowded map changed dramatically from 2025 to 2026 for Wake Forest. Given that Wake Forest is projected to double in population in the next 10 years, and there are new houses going up all over Wake Forest and Rollsville, how could your maps have changed so much?
I think we've addressed this question a couple of times, but we'll try it one more time just to make sure we're getting all the nuance of it. So looking at, so that was the projected crowding, and so here's you're looking at the projected enrollment. I can't remember which slide it is. Pardon me while I'm zipping through. I apologize if this makes you a little dizzy. Um, Here's what you're seeing the difference. So the projected growth map on the left was the one that we produced around this time last year based on what we were getting from residential development updates from our town planners and what the trends at that time were showing us about in migration into the district from other areas, as well as current birth rates. What has changed dramatically over the last 2 or 3 years, and the trends are now starting to really make it look like a reliable trend, is that in migration to the district, but particularly international families moving into the district, has slowed considerably over the last several years, as well as kindergarten or birth rates. Birth rates have dropped significantly in the district. So even if we're projecting to get more population, like adult population, we're not necessarily seeing the same correlation for students for student school age students coming into the district. And so that shift is really what you're seeing here between the map on the left and the map on the right, is that those updates from our municipal partners about residential developments that have maybe slowed, as well as those demographic trends about families that historically have moved into the district at really high rates, or having high birth rates. Both of those numbers being diminished over the last couple of years have really impacted our forecast for the 10-year outlook.
We're going to jump to traffic. There are several questions related to traffic, but I think they're all asking the same thing,
Okay.
more or less. If you were to change the calendar, what will you do to ease traffic and address safety concerns? Currently, when all three tracks are in, the traffic is awful and unsafe. Will someone be hired to direct traffic?
That's an excellent question, and I think we need to kind of work with the principals at the school and our municipal partners that serve those schools to determine what that best approach is. I think what I'm hearing the concern is, based on conversations we've had with other groups, is that right now, when the two biggest tracks, like track 1 and 4, are in at the same time, it feels like the traffic patterns and carpool are a little bit different than, let's say, when one of those two tracks is out. And so the concern is that if that's what it really feels like when everybody's in the school at the same time, you know, what's that going to look like? So the good news is that if tracks 1, 3, and 4 are in, that's your full population of students. So you already have a look and feel for what that looks like. If we need to work with our municipal partners and the town and whoever those individuals are that serve the school, as well as the principals, to maybe come up with better traffic safety plans, we're certainly amenable to partnering with them to make sure that happens. We agree carpool traffic is its own situation that's completely separate just from student enrollment. We get that, we hear that, and we'll work with our teams to make sure that there are plans in place if a recommendation is made.
Okay, we're going to move on to transfer related questions.
Okay.
There are several questions asking about transfer requests to Heritage Elementary and Middle School, asking how many calendar change applications and transfer requests have been denied in the past 2 years, and how about in the past 5 years? And why are they being denied?
Sure. I can't give you a number today in this setting, but I understand the question. And the question is, there are a lot of families who are interested in attending one of these two schools. Why is it the transfers aren't being approved? Well, I just want to draw your attention back to because the base enrollment for the school isn't sufficient to keep it full, and the schools nearby have sufficient capacity to serve their students. This school has not been operating a track two for quite some time. Same for the middle school. That means that what appears to be space isn't really space because there's no room to put students when there's no track two. So it's really been operating almost at a 75%, and that's a rough number of its capacity by not offering a track two. In addition, what we talked about earlier in some of the other conversations is, particularly at the middle school level, there's no crowding concerns. There's no need to relieve crowding at any of the additional schools. And if we were to add more students to Heritage Middle beyond what are already there, it would further, you know, make the other schools lower enrolled. And so you've got we have enough seats in the region to serve students at their base schools. We don't need to be adding them to another school. And it sounds like a very callous answer, but it's really just a numbers situation. Each school needs to have a sufficient student population to be able to offer their math classes, to be able to make sure they have all of their specialists in place, offer high quality electives, and the less students they're serving, the less able they are to provide all those options. So as a district, we have to try to keep our enrollment balanced across the schools so that those services can be provided. But again, because the schools are so under enrolled and not operating a track two, there's actually not as much available space in the schools as someone might think because there's no room in that track two space. Not sure if that
Okay.
hits it, but maybe more questions will tease out the aspects of it.
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of answers to that question. This one is a little different. Wake Forest Middle is our base school, and Heritage Middle is our year-round magnet school option. If there is a calendar change, will my children still have the option to go to Heritage Middle if they are in Heritage Elementary now and will be going into middle school in 28, 29?
Ooh, okay, so future transfers. I'm gonna rewind for current. If you're a family that's currently attending one of the two schools, however it is that you got there, and the calendar changes and that doesn't matter to you, you'd rather stay at the school, those types of transfers would certainly be honored so you could finish out through the 5th grade or finish out through the 8th grade. Future transfers for a school you haven't yet attended are a little bit harder for us to come up with right now, but we can certainly think through that as a planning team. I know on the enrollment plan side of the house, when we make an enrollment plan change and change the base attendance area for a school, we only allow for those types of stability transfers. That's what we would call this type of transfer for students that are already attending the school. We don't necessarily allow for transfers in the future if you've never attended that school. So we've got to think about that. It's a very interesting question. We should definitely bring that to the planning team for additional thought and sort of response. The other piece would be if you have an older student who's already attending one of the schools and that younger student's coming in, let's say in kindergarten or 6th grade, and they would be in the school together. I know for sure we could approve those types of transfers because our core policy says that we can keep siblings together on the same school site.
This one is looking back a little bit. Why were some families who were at Heritage Elementary told they could not attend Heritage Middle and had to move to Wake Forest Middle?
So I think that's probably base assignment areas. Not all students who attend our schools are the ones who live in the base attendance area. Some live in a different base attendance area, but get to the school by either transfer or calendar application. And so there's not a guarantee that they can always go forward into the next school in that path. Um, that's probably what it is. Or there was maybe a reassignment in the area where they're no longer base assigned to Heritage Middle. And so they had to go to their newly assigned school of Wake Forest. If that person wants to give some send an email to student assignment at wcpss.net. One of our staff members can certainly look into your specific situation. If you have questions about your own particular address, we could certainly help with that. But generally speaking, I would say we probably had a base assignment change, and so that changed it. Or the student that was at Heritage Elementary wasn't there as a base student, because I know all base Heritage Elementary students feed on into Heritage Middle. And it could be that there's just that switch over between 5th and 6th grade if it's not your base school.
We're going to move into some other questions on
Sure.
different topics. Can NC Demography provide data on charter enrollment by WCPSS base school zone?
We as a district do get some of that information because you may or may not know charter schools will bill the home district for their portion of whatever the county appropriations are for that particular student. So, as a district, we are aware of how many charter school students reside in our county but are being served at a charter school. And some of that information is available to our demographers. The challenge is that some of it is confidential student data, and so we can't broadly share it, but we do have some understanding of the charter impact in the region. And I can say it's significant. It's not insignificant in this region.
Can the research citations be provided for parents to review?
So they are posted to our website. So if you go to, let me see if I can find that link. Um, so this is the research you're referring to. If you go to this website and kind of navigate to step 6, the links are all right there on the website. And then for our forecast, if you stay on this website and go up to step 1, you can get the links to all of our forecast information.
Okay, what's the cost of running a year-round elementary school versus a traditional elementary school?
Sure. So this is a little bit of a nuance. I hate to say like it's hard to answer, but it's a little bit hard to answer. So one is that all of our schools, if you, as you may know, are funded based on head count. So the total number of students that are calculated as being part of the average daily membership early in the year, we call it 20th day. It's usually sometime in September. That information gets reported to the Department of Public Instruction, and then they fund the school based on that number, or they fund the district based on the number we send them as a whole district. Then that information also is used to determine how many individual grade level teachers you get, because some of you might hear the term months of employment. And so that helps to determine that. We do projections now to get ready for next year, and then there's a reconciliation that happens. So if the school has sufficient number of students to fill all their seats and offer all of their programs, then they're good to go. What happens with multi-track is because we're splitting students up across tracks. If I have a family, let's say that's on track 2, and let's say there are 14 students currently scheduled for that class, but I really need 18 to earn that whole teacher. I either have to convince families from a different track to move to that track, or I have to find a way to make up the difference within my own budget as a principal and maybe borrow some months from a different track to keep that one section open for 14 students. If I'm on the same calendar, track 4 or traditional, I can move students around and I don't affect their calendar. I might just take them from, teacher A's class to teacher B's class, but they're still on the same calendar and that doesn't change everything for the family. So there's a lot more flexibility for the principal to keep balanced enrollments across their classes, and to use all those months of employment that they earn as best as possible. When they have to really stretch those to make it work on a particular track, sometimes they have to get extra help from the district to make that funding work, which then means that school starts to cost more. It's not so much about the maintenance and operations of the school. It's really about making sure there's sufficient staff to support the students across all 4 tracks. That's where the extra costs come in.
Okay, the district's data shows crowding exceeding 100% under a traditional or track 4 calendar. How will the district prevent classrooms from becoming overcapacity? And I think this one's related, where will additional students be placed if current classrooms and mobile units are at capacity?
Sure. So I think the only elementary school that would fit into that situation that the person's referencing would be Jones Dairy Elementary, and that school is not currently being considered for a calendar change because of its current crowding level. Heritage Elementary, let's go back to, oh, I'm so sorry. They're talking probably about this chart here. Yes. If we were to go traditional, this and remove the trailers, then Heritage Elementary would not be able to fit. Heritage Elementary would need to maintain its trailers with its current projected enrollment. However, it is looking like it's continuing to drop. At the middle school level, 103% isn't significantly overcrowded, and most middle school principals can manage that. So we wouldn't necessarily need to do any reassignments to address that, but we would need to monitor that over time if one of those growth patterns were to shift and change. If the growth in this area stopped declining and started to increase, we would have to look at that. But right now, there aren't concerns based on the recent trends and what we know about the residential neighborhoods assigned to the school. But again, something we've got to think about in terms of the potential impact of maybe some growth in the area over the next several years. So it's a good question to ask. We do have to be thoughtful about that.
Considering this data, teacher retention, academic results, teacher perception of school leadership, student behavior, and school climate, heritage schools are performing stronger than Rollsville and Wake Forest. So why change?
Gotcha. Again, I think it was asked probably early on in the questions. This isn't. We agree. This is a very These are popular schools that have really good reputations and strong cultures. And our hope, obviously, would be that those cultures would prevail regardless of the calendar that the school was operating under. So this is really specifically a financial consideration to try to save the district some money and to make sure that the schools can operate effectively. One thing that I don't think everyone sees, because I think your principals do a fabulous job of making everything appear seamless, is that particularly in the area of specialists, special education teachers, counselors, things like that, they have to get really creative to try to make sure all of those resources are available across the three tracks because they don't have full sets of enrollment. I think I've heard, maybe not here for these schools, but in some areas maybe you have substitutes for as long as 3 weeks at a time because you don't have enough months of employment for a teacher to be there, or the teacher needs to have a break. um, you could have math classes that are with 40 students in them because it's the only way you can ensure that the students get the math program that they specifically need, where if they were all on the same calendar, we could distribute those students a little bit better and have more manageable class sizes. So there are some programming adjustments that your schools have done an amazing job managing, but it's getting harder and harder and harder with the lower enrollment at the schools. So again, this is not to try to take anything away from what the community feels about these schools. We know there are some strong ties, and the community really, loves their schools, and we love that. This would really just be to help deal with some financial struggles and that the schools are facing right now, and some operational struggles that they're facing as they try to keeping all three tracks going.
Okay, this is a little different topic. Does the data take
I
into
can't hear you, Melissa.
oh, mm, can you hear me now?
Mm-mm.
Can you hear me now?
Think I can see some of the question document. Are we looking in the area?
I, can you hear me now? We're in
I've seen
other.
several questions in here about apartments and townhomes and new developments. I think we've addressed several of those. We are looking at the information that the town planners are sharing with us, but we will certainly make sure that the planning team looks over all of that data again. We've looked at things about transfers. Um, there, I do. There's got to be a few questions in here about calendar alignment. I know that comes up a lot. That a lot of families have gotten really used to having K-8 calendar alignment, and let's say the middle school goes traditional, right? Does that then mean that we won't have calendar alignment K-8? And it is a very real possibility. As a district, as I said in some of our other questions that we had, multi-track year round is really used to help us manage enrollment growth and make sure that we have sufficient seats in areas that just don't have enough capacity. This region has gotten to a point where, particularly at the middle school level, there is sufficient capacity. So what you're starting to see in the district is that while we still are going to have to rely on multi-track elementary schools in some areas to make sure we meet those class size legislation requirements, we're going to have less and less year-round middle schools. And so the norm is going to be more of a 6-12 calendar alignment than a K-8 calendar alignment when it comes to multi-track. So you'll have that traditional starting in 6th grade and stay on that traditional through high school, as all of our high schools, barring a handful of exceptions, operate on a traditional calendar. Some have an early college calendar, which looks a little bit more like a Wake Tech or an NC State calendar.
Can you hear me now?
I can't hear you.
Oh boy.
I don't know how I lost your microphone, Melissa. I'm so sorry.
I am sorry.
Someone asked it's sort of a personal question. It looks like, what are the specifics that the calendar can change could provide that outweigh the concerns that the community has? And I think that's a very valid point. Is that as a community, there's clearly a fondness for the multi-track. For those of you that are already attending the school, there's clearly established patterns and I heard a lot of information, particularly in the thought exchange about scheduling track out camps and things like that, how for some families it's a little bit easier to do them as incremental breaks throughout the year versus one big chunk in the summer. So all of those things are being weighed and considered and will be shared with the board. From a planning team, again, please know that we do not discount any of those perspectives or concerns. The reality is we are just charged by the board to think about operational efficiency and to bring recommendations related to that. The board certainly will weigh and consider all the factors that are impacting a community beyond simple operational efficiency. And then other schools in the area that might be more underutilized than these schools are already operating on a traditional calendar. So obviously, changing the calendar isn't something we can do to support those schools. So we do look at other opportunities to help. With the membership at those schools. Perhaps they have excessive trailers, or perhaps we could look to relieve nearby crowded schools. Mhm. I'm not sure if it's come up. Let's see here. Um, Lots of questions about, could we not just open up track 2 and approve transfers and fill the school? And that could be an approach. However, the downside would be that that would further under enroll other schools in the area, which instead of so while it maybe supports the enrollment at Heritage Middle, then becomes a challenge for the other schools in the area that also need enrollment. So if year round as a district we've declared as being um, used for capacity management, if we don't need the seats in the region, the question is just whether or not we need to continue doing multi-track. Looking at other questions. Sorry about the technical difficulty, the not being able to hear the host read the questions. Um, There are several questions in here about traffic and intersections. I can't speak to those specifically, just it's not, it's outside of the scope of our work, but we will make sure we get those to the appropriate people in the district to make sure that all of those things are weighed and considered before the board makes any decisions about calendar changes. I see some ideas here about a single shared entry and exit. How can we interact with the board directly? So I do know that the board probably won't take this up for consideration until their May 19th board meeting, which means that you could certainly sign up for public comment as an on agenda topic item for that particular meeting. You could sign up for public comment as an off agenda topic, item for any of the other board meetings that are between now and then. But the thought exchange, I will say, is probably the most powerful place for you to get information to the board because the board can see every comment that's posted, just as the planning team can. And then we also, of course, summarize and analyze that data and share it with the board. I do know that the last cycle, there were two elementary schools in particular that were specifically being recommended to go from multi track to traditional. And because of the feedback of the community, the board elected to still make a change, but they made track 4 the decision so that the families could maintain that year-round type calendar and flow that they were used to while also meeting those operational efficiency needs. The difference this year is we have made no recommendations to the board. Right now, we're in an information seeking stage. The recommendations won't be made till April 14th. So, if there is a recommendation for these schools to have a calendar change, it won't be made until April 14th. And then at that time, you'll know for sure, and there'll be additional outreach if they're included in the recommendations. Mm. Someone asked about polling. One thing to think about is we I don't mean to say this in a way that sounds flippant, but we know that everybody at Heritage would just ask to stay multi-track, right? That's without question. We do know how popular the program is. We know how popular the schools are. We know how loved um, having that multi-track year round, how ingrained into that community. I know these schools opened on multi-track, right? It's just part of how this community and culture was set up. So we get that. We hear that. We understand that. We know that changing the calendar, not changing the calendar would be the most preferred option. And so right now, before we make any recommendations that might potentially have the board considering changing the calendar, we really do want to weigh and consider. And a lot of the feedback you're sharing tonight is really helpful, as well as the feedback that we've read in the thought exchange so far. Thinking about the development growth maps. We're going to do a double dip, talk with the town of Wake Forest again and make sure that we didn't get our, wires crossed as we were doing all of our projected enrollment numbers. But yeah, we do understand very clearly as a team, that the schools in this particular region, they would much prefer to stay multi-track. And so that's without question. We understand that. Think this was a question that was asked a little bit earlier about could we potentially look at the boundaries for the schools and maybe add some students to the schools so that they could be more full? Certainly something we can weigh and consider. We just need to make sure we're not negatively impacting schools that don't need crowding relief. The closest, there's a question about what would be the nearest year-round school if let's say Heritage went traditional. Both Heritages went traditional. I believe the closest school to the region would probably either be the Durant Road schools and maybe Harris Creek Elementary, other than the Sanford Creek and Jones Dairy at the elementary level. But at the middle school level, I would think Durant would probably be the closest track four school in the region if for some reason these schools went traditional. And again, that recommendation has not been made. Talked a lot about transfers already. Could we look at just taking the trailers off of Heritage Elementary? That's certainly a consideration. That's part of that planning protocol. How often school so this is, someone said, "How often are schools under this type of review ultimately decided not to make a switch?" And so this is a new approach we're trying this year. In years past, we would get a very small list of maybe 2 schools and make recommendations of those to the board, and then only deal with those 2, and then those would ultimately have some sort of a change made. This year, in response to feedback from community about like, wait a minute, we didn't even know we were being considered, and now you're telling us we're being going to be recommended for traditional. We thought it best to sort of bring the community in a little bit earlier in the planning process and say, hey, here's about 11 schools, and that's how many we're looking at right now that might benefit from a calendar reduction based on what we're seeing for their underutilization before we make a recommendation to the board. Let's collect some community feedback that can help us determine what the best approach might be. So this is the first time we're doing it in this sequence. So it's highly likely that not all 11 schools will end up having a specific recommendation being made to the board on the 14th. So we do encourage you to follow along in our process. And perhaps even watch that facilities committee meeting or look for the notices that come out as that presentation is being made. I'm seeing a new question about has the district considered perhaps using the modified calendar? So those of you that may not be familiar, there's a handful of schools in our district that operate on what's called a modified calendar. Similar to year round, they have a 9-week in period, but then they have a 2-week out period instead of a 3-week out period. For the modified calendar schools, it does not add capacity to the school because those breaks aren't sufficient to rotate in a different group of students. So they're in for 9 weeks, out for 2 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. And then they end up with somewhere between a 6 and an 8 week summer, depending on how the winter break falls. So Carver Elementary in Wendell is on that calendar. Partnership Elementary, one of our magnet schools downtown. Moore Square Middle, one of our magnet schools downtown. Centennial Middle, one of our magnet schools downtown, and Southeast Raleigh High School are the 5 that I'm familiar with. I think there might also be Neuse River Middle and one of the East Garners. I think it's East Garner Elementary, operate on that modified schedule. The legislature has restricted our ability to use that calendar. So the only schools moving forward that could potentially have that calendar are schools that are considered restart schools. So right now, legislatively, we're not allowed to use that calendar as a district for a non-restart school. It is a great calendar, though. I love it. It's very similar to a multi-track year round. Has the benefits of the breaks, and a little bit longer summer. Unfortunately, the legislature has restricted us from using that calendar for most of our schools. From a middle school perspective, why do you consider track four when track two tracks out during breaks and sports seasons? Um, so I think what they're saying is if we were to let's do a single track four, it just seems that that's what the community has shared with us is the preferred calendar. So that if we were to only operate one track at a year-round school, track four just has always been the one that's identified as most popular. So as a district, we sort of defaulted to that preference. It also helps with the predictability for transportation to know when students will be in session. So if we have track four schools, traditional schools, multi-track, so there are some operational efficiency gains too for using the track four schedule. But we can certainly have the planning team consider whether or not a different track, if the school was to go single track, would be a better operating track. A question about the projected decline versus whether or not the decline is sustained in enrollment. So the decline has been sustained for the last 5 years. We've seen a roughly 10% drop in enrollment in both campuses over the last 5 years. So that is a trend that has come to fruition and is continuing. So it's no longer a future projection at this point. It's a trend that we're responding to. Question about the two schools being on the same campus, and if a decision is made for one, does it mean it would be made for both? So I think probably yes. I don't want to speak for the board, but we have seen historically that the board really prefers that if the elementary and middle school are literally located on the same campus, that they operate on the same calendar. We tried last year to open one of our new elementary schools as multi-track year round, and it happened to be co-located on a campus with a traditional middle school. And the board just really didn't feel comfortable having two different calendars on the same campus for both elementary and middle. So the likelihood that they would ask us to, if we were to make a change, that it apply to both schools is pretty high. But that's not to say that it's 100%, but I'd say it's in the high 90s. So what if a recommendation were to be made for heritage for both the heritages and it was to move forward, I would I would suppose that the board would most likely want the two schools operating on the same calendar, but I can't guarantee it. It is possible they might make a different decision if the data and the research and the parent feedback were to say something different. Um, the traffic, I'm trying to see, are there any new questions coming up? Question is, why are we considering building new schools or doing major renovations to schools when they may not be needed? Excellent question. And so, one thing I'd like to show related to the current capital improvement plan. See if I can find that slide without making everybody dizzy. Okay, did I go too far? Yeah. So I think, yeah, this was the slide that we were looking at. The schools that you see over in the eastern part of the county are very much needed. This is one of the highest growth regions of the district, and these are areas that have very few schools currently because they have not been experiencing high growth until now. Morrisville High School, if anybody knows that region, Panther Creek High School is currently capped. Green Hope High School, that serves as the overflow, is also equally full. It's not capped. Both of those two schools have significant numbers of trailer units that have been on their campuses for a very long time. So the growth and the current crowding in that region really is driving the need for that school. Parkside Middle, which is the school here, it's coming in a few years. If you'll, Alston Ridge is a school that's is full and crowded. Mills Park Middle has historically been capped for a number of years in this region, so that's what's driving those two campuses. And then here it's just the historic growth in this Holly Springs Apex corridor, Fuquay corridor that has generated that. But you'll notice that these are the ones here in green are already open. The orange one here is going to open for 26, 27. So you'll notice there's a vast reduction. We're going to be opening maybe one new school every couple of years and emphasizing more on the renovations. The renovations are less about adding new capacity and more about managing our inventory and our assets. These schools are located in areas with continuing enrollment. Some are even in high growth areas. And so we just need to make sure that our buildings are sustaining, appropriate learning environments over time. For those of you who may not know, some of our schools, predate the 70s or even predate, we have some schools that are as much as 100 years old because of the merger of the city and the county school districts. So it's just making sure that those schools can continue to serve populations in those communities for the time to come. If we have growth in the same area where those renovations are happening, then we will try to see if we can add capacity to the site. If we don't have growth, then we worry more about just making sure that those schools are healthy, and well fit, upfitted to serve communities and students for the 40, 50, 60 years of the life of a school. I see that there are some comments more so than questions, and maybe it's a question. Is the district concerned at all that if we were to, let's say, make calendar changes, that families might choose to leave the district? And certainly, we want to be mindful of that, and we don't want families to feel like we're not the best choice for their students. So we are certainly weighing in all those types of considerations as well. Yes. Team, I know we had some mic issues where I couldn't hear anybody. I'm looking at our questions document. Are there any questions that we haven't um, answered? Well, we appreciate you all joining us tonight. We've gotten a couple of thank yous in here, so we do appreciate that. Those can sustain us for a very long time. So, some questions about, sure, students are currently maybe not enrolling as at a higher rate in schools because families are what I sometimes the phrase I use, aging in place. I'm a family with two children that happen to both be in college. So when my students left high school and went to college, we stayed in that same family home for a period of time and we were no longer contributing to the student enrollment in that area. So until we left that neighborhood and moved somewhere else, there wasn't even an opportunity for more students, to be generated by our home per se. Yes, that is something that as a district we look at is our families aging in place, and there's an opportunity for the market to maybe shift over, where a lot of families might move away in their retirement years to the beach, to the mountains, just somewhere else, downsize, whatever it is. And then the next family moving into that community because of the way that community is designed might likely have younger students and then pick back up the enrollment. Absolutely, we are monitoring those types of changes as well. So in established neighborhoods, we do monitor what's happening with those market changes, to make sure that we aren't undercutting the capacity that we might need in the future if those families that maybe have aged out of our schools do move and the new families come in and replace them. So yes, that is a factor that we consider in our long range planning. Questions about particularly our Jones Dairy families that are on the call. So I'm at Jones Dairy. We know my school's kind of full and crowded, and we might even have to, start opening up our track two, right? So we're a school that is not being considered for a calendar change, and we feed into Heritage Middle. What happens if Heritage Middle is track four and my student's on track two, and then I have that older student going into Heritage Middle? Am I going to be on split tracks? Certainly, that is not the goal of the district. The district does not want that to happen. And that is something we would have to really consider if we were thinking about keeping the middle school on a track four, if it needs a calendar change, right? So that those are very important factors that the planning team needs to take into consideration because we do not want to intentionally create a situation where students. It's one thing if you're at a multi-track year-round elementary school and then a traditional middle and a traditional high school. That's awkward, but at least that's 6/12 calendar alignment. But to have a student at the elementary school on track 1, 2, or 3, and then a student at the middle school on track 4, that is definitely not ideal. That's different, right? That's a different type of complexity, a different type of challenge. So we certainly would do everything we could to avoid that. And so that is something we would have to weigh and consider. Absolutely. Question about going into the community. So what we're doing is we're reaching out to all families that have students that live in the attendance area. So even if they don't go to the current school, right? They're maybe choosing a magnet option or they're, on transfer to a different school for maybe traditional calendar. We've reached out to all of those families that are in these impact areas to invite them to participate in our virtual sessions and to invite them to participate in the thought exchange. In addition, we're going to we are recording the session, so we will post it to our website Probably take us a couple days because it has to format and YouTube has to accept it and all of that. But it'll take a couple days. We'll get it up on the website and then we'll send a reminder out to everybody on that. It's the very same list saying if you couldn't join us, please, you're welcome to watch the recording and please, 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 please participate in the thought exchange. This is your best opportunity to give us information. If we get to the point where we're making official recommendations, then we'll have a whole different round of engagement that people can participate in if a specific recommendation is actually made. If we Okay, that. Okay, I think we've tapped out. Team, can you let me know in the chat if there's more questions that we need to address? Oh, sure. So one more question, again, just to repeat, I think something that I've said a couple of times is that right now, no recommendations have been made. We're in the early stages, initial discussion stages, if you will. We've identified some schools in the district. I think when I shared it with the board, we said might, maybe, perhaps, possibly benefit from a calendar reduction, right? A track reduction to be more operationally efficient and to be able to make sure their programs are thriving and that they have all the resources in the right places and that students can get all of their needs met, right? That's the goal. It's really about making sure that the resources match the student needs and that we're not stretching our dollars so thin that some students are actually missing out on some programs that they really should have access to. So that's key number one. And then number two is we're now engaging with the community. We're having this session tonight with you. We have a couple of other sessions for other areas of the county scheduled over the next 2 weeks. Our online thought exchanges are running. So you're able to use those to post feedback and and thoughts and rate each other's thoughts. And then we will make official recommendations through the facilities committee meeting on April 14th. So that point is when you'll know whether or not your school is officially being recommended for a change. At this point, no recommendations have been made. Another opportunity for comments. So we've had a couple people ask this in slightly different ways. You're certainly welcome to sign up to speak at a board meeting and in their public comment period, and you can do that at any time for any public board meeting. Just know that if you are considered an off agenda topic, so if you were to go over the next couple of weeks, you would just go last because they want to hear from people who are speaking on topics that are on the agenda for that evening first. And then as we get closer to the recommendations being finalized and the board really being asked to consider them for approval, which will be later in May, you certainly would be welcome to, sign up to speak there if you felt like there were some additional thoughts that needed to be shared. But as far as we're concerned, this and the continuing thought exchange will be going on through April 5th. And then if your school does have specific recommendations that are made on April 14th, we'll have another round of information sessions and opportunities to provide additional feedback if needed, so that the board can weigh that as well. All right. So for the thought exchange, you can get to it a couple of ways. If you've got your phone handy, you can, scan that QR code and it'll take you straight to it. Or you can type in at tejoin.com that code, and that'll take you to our thought exchange for this particular topic, the two heritage campuses. If you're interested in any of the information we've shared tonight, or any of the research that we talked about tonight, or the forecast report that we talked about tonight, you can go to that assignment planning website link here at the top. If you go to step 6, on that list, because it's like steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you get down to step 6, that'll link you specifically to the calendar discussion items, the two research documents that I shared that I mentioned earlier, as well as our FAQs. They're not up to date yet because we just had the session, so we'll be updating those over the next week or so with some more responses based on what we talked about here today, or questions that were brought forward that we couldn't answer, just a little outside of our scope, like the transportation routing and so forth. And then if you stay on that assignment planning and look at steps 1 through 5, any of the other information we've talked about the forecast or anything like that, you can find that information all curated on that one site so that you can get it all from there. So if you want to bookmark that website and kind of go back and check it regularly for updates, that's a forever website. It's a perpetual website. You can do that. So with that, I think we've hit it all. It's 7:24, so we'll give you a couple of minutes back of your evening. We really appreciate your open and honest participation, giving us really good detailed questions so that we can take those back to the planning team for deeper research and further consideration. It's very vital to our process, and it'll be really helpful as we make official recommendations to the board in a little bit. So just remember that we're going to present a summary of the feedback that we've received, as well as specific recommendations to the board at their facilities committee meeting on April 14th. And we expect them to take a final vote sometime in May. The thought exchange that we have here will remain open through April 5th. That gives staff enough time to compile all the results before we present to them on the 14th. We encourage you to continue to post thoughts and comments and to go back and rate. You can go back anytime after you've participated and add thoughts or rate more thoughts. That's fine, or explore what other people are saying. Please continue to monitor your email. We will send more notifications the same way that we did this time. We'll also make sure your principals have that same information so they can include that in their principal messages. But we'd also encourage you to look at that FAQ section. And then if there's anyone that you know of that would have benefited from being here tonight but couldn't join us, just let them know that we're going to post the recording in a couple of days and they can find it on that assignment planning site. So again, thank you so much for your active participation. We had lots and lots of questions, and we just hope that you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Good night.